I left my home, which is just north of Denver, for Alaska on June 8, 2015. I arrived in Fairbanks on day 9, and I took day 10 off to reorganize and recuperate. That was completely unnecessary. Just like staying at Yukon River Camp on day 11 was completely unnecessary. So I wasted 2 precious days doing that. I returned home on day 22. The round trip was a total of 6,707 miles. I had a few 400-plus mile days, and I had a few 250 mile and under days. But the average was 320 miles per day. On the next Alaska trip, I'll shoot for closer to 500 miles per day. But my personal preference is to travel at a pace where I can take it all in and enjoy it. In my mind, it's not a marathon or a race, it's a vacation. I have a great deal of respect for all those riders out there that pack 600, 700, or 800 miles into a day. I'm genuinely impressed by those motorcycle gladiators that can pull that off. But I just don't have it in me. I knew going into this trip that I would probably stay at motels the majority of the time, as I had a lot of gear that needed to be recharged, video and photo files that needed to be transferred onto my laptop and backed up onto a portable drive, which takes a few hours to do. I was also updating my website with stories and information and uploading photos to the website because I had a lot of friends, family, co-workers, and neighbors following me on the trip on a daily basis. Especially my father, who was fighting cancer at the time, and he would literally sit in front of the computer for hours each day following me in near real time through my Spot GPS tracker. I didn't want to let any of those people down by skipping days with the updates. I was up until 1 to 2 in the morning each night going through that same routine, and getting up at 5 or 6 in the morning to prepare for each day, which no doubt added to my fatigue every day. So I can't blame it all on the seat. Finding motels was really not an issue along the way, except for the second night in Great Falls, Montana, and the third night in Calgary, Alberta. There were petroleum conventions going on in both of those cities, and it was nearly impossible to find a room in Great Falls and impossible to find one in Calgary, which is why I stayed in Olds, Alberta, about 60 miles north of Calgary. There were plenty of vacancies in each motel I stayed at throughout the rest of the trip. So on my repeat trip to Alaska, there'll be no need to take the camping gear. Why take what you're not going to use? And that'll be about 20 pounds less I'll have to carry. But if your interest is camping, I saw a whole lot of great looking campgrounds along the way. Just zoom in on Google Maps a little tighter. You'll find them. I found the road conditions to be pretty much what I'd expected throughout the trip. Average. One must keep in mind that the roads wind through areas that experience some pretty harsh weather conditions throughout the year. There are miles of construction areas spread throughout the whole route, many requiring you to wait for, then follow a pilot vehicle, and oftentimes they'll ask the motorcycles to move up to the front of the line. There's a long stretch of highway in the Yukon Territory just northwest of Destruction Bay that had some pretty severe frost heaves. If you're prepared for them, they provide you with some great entertainment to help break the monotony of riding all those miles. But if you're not careful, or one takes you by surprise, you could find yourself tangled up in a heap of metal on the side of the road that was once your motorcycle. I think I came off the seat 10 to 12 inches on that one. The Alaska Highway begins in Dawson Creek, British Columbia, and ends 1,387 miles later in Delta Junction, Alaska. There are some stretches of gravel roads along the Alaska Highway, but each one was well maintained. I highly recommend doing some research on the Milepost website. It's loaded with helpful information for planning a trip through Canada to Alaska, such as fuel stops, campgrounds, etc. You can even order their book to carry along with you, which I saw several motorcyclists using along the way. I didn't even know it existed until I was halfway into British Columbia. Short and sweet and pretty much a no-brainer, being prepared for any weather conditions is the key. I experienced a 66-degree temperature swing from Denver to the Arctic Circle and back. From 35 degrees in British Columbia to 101 degrees in Billings, Montana. I saw rain, sleet, hail, just a touch of snow, and sweltering heat. For the most part, I'm going to defer to the many great YouTube videos out there from those veterans of the Dalton that made it all the way to Prudhoe Bay. But the day I rode the 115 miles of the 415-mile Dalton, the weather was perfect. It was clear, sunny, and in the mid-80s. For that stretch I rode, I thought the road conditions were pretty good. There were some rough patches here and there and some big potholes to watch out for. But I rode through a construction zone in Montana a few days earlier that was much worse than those first 115 miles of the Dalton. The only issue I faced on the Dalton was self-inflicted. When I stopped to take some pictures and I thought the kickstand was down, as I was straddling the bike and let it lean on the kickstand as I was looking through the camera lens. Down she went. After struggling for about 20 to 30 minutes to pick the bike up, a friendly truck driver stopped and helped me put her back up on her feet. I do know for a fact that the weather conditions on the Dalton can have a severe effect on the road conditions and make things absolutely miserable for riders. There are many YouTube videos out there that cover that subject too. I'll just wait until I ride the Dalton again, and then maybe I'll feel as though I have a right to talk about it. As I mentioned earlier, I carried a 2-gallon Rotopax full of fuel from the beginning of the trip to the end. I'd set a rule for myself to always begin looking for a fuel stop every time my fuel gauge was at the halfway mark. That way I figured I would never find myself in a desperate position trying to find fuel with the gauge pushing the dreaded empty mark, even though I had the spare 2 gallons on board as a backup. That turned out to be a pretty good plan. There were a couple of times where I thought there would be a fuel stop ahead, but they turned out to be closed, or in this case, they were out of fuel. In another situation, I was well below the halfway mark on my fuel gauge and stopped at this self-service station. But my credit cards wouldn't work, and neither did Rob's, the guy I met at this fuel stop. He poured the 1 gallon from his fuel container in his tank and took off. And I waited for about 30 minutes until someone finally stopped to fill up, and I bought some gas from them. If you're riding all the way to Prudhoe Bay, you'll most likely need to carry an extra supply of fuel, as there are no fuel stops between Coldfoot and Prudhoe Bay because they're separated by 242 miles of nothing but wilderness. I never went into this trip with the intention of meeting people or making friends, but I developed a great friendship with 3 people, and those friendships are still going strong to this day, 5 years after this Alaska trip. First was Greg from Pennsylvania, who I met on the way north at the Canadian border. We rode together for the rest of that day into Olds, Alberta. Greg came out to Colorado a couple of years ago, and we did some riding in the mountains of Colorado. There will be more trips together in the future too. Next was Kevin from Northern Ireland and Jim from Tennessee. Kevin was a victim of one of those gas stations being unexpectedly closed when he ran out of fuel in the Yukon. Since this Alaska trip, I've ridden with Kevin in Ireland in 2016 and throughout Scandinavia in 2017. Both Kevin and Jim throughout Colorado in the Southwest in 2018, and Jim to Yellowstone in 2019. And there are more trips to come in the future with both Kevin and Jim also. You can't help but to meet people on a trip like this. I met many different people from all over the world. Some of them I ran into multiple times after several days and several thousands of miles apart. It was a fun and rewarding benefit of this trip that I didn't expect. One quick note about my upcoming return trip to Alaska and the Dalton Highway before I get to the final segment of this video. Kevin and I were going to do this trip together. He would fly into Denver from Ireland and we would hit the road next year in June of 2020. We just needed to secure the dates with our jobs, then it would be all set. In August, Kevin went on what looked to be, judging from the pictures he was sending me, a great motorcycle trip in France and Spain with his buddies. I knew something was wrong because I had sent Kevin a few texts and a couple of days passed with no reply. Then while I was working on this video, Kevin was barely able to tap out a short reply saying he was in a crash and he was pretty banged up. I finally got another text from his buddy Jeff, who was riding with him, letting me know what happened. Kevin suffered some pretty nasty injuries, but he's slowly recovering well. It seems that they were all on their way to see the Motels Bridge in France when he crashed. But Kevin was finally able to see the bridge when he opened the curtains in his hospital room. So that puts the return to Alaska trip in a holding pattern for now. But I'm confident it'll happen, one way or another, sooner or later. I used two GoPro Hero 3 Black Editions on the Alaska trip. Since then, I've upgraded to the 4, the 5, the 6, the Hero Session, and most recently the Hero 7 Black. The stabilization on the 7 is amazing compared to the older versions. It took the footage from this to this. I always take a lot of camera gear with me on my trips, and I'll never say it's too much, because I always use most of it. This photo doesn't even include my laptop, portable hard drive, or charging equipment. Now for that monstrosity on the front of my helmet. I experimented with a variety of ram mounts in order to get just the right angle and level for the camera. At one point, as I prepared for the Alaska trip, I even mounted a gimbal in the mix with those ram mounts, and the stabilization was great. But the front of the helmet was just too heavy, and every time I flipped the modular helmet up, it would slam back down in my face. So I scrapped the helmet gimbal. Then last spring for the Yellowstone trip, I found the Pro Shot. It's light as a feather, mounts to the helmet easy using dual lock strips, and it's in just the right position on the helmet, as I like to show some of the gauges and windshield on the bike to give my shots some perspective for the POV videos. I always leave the first camera mounted to my helmet. Then the second, I like to move around in various positions on the bike, as I have ram mounts attached all over the bike. And with the ram arms, I can adjust the cameras in many different directions and angles. This helps break the monotony of just having footage from the helmet camera by itself. For the helmet-mounted camera and any other cameras that are mounted on the bike within easy reach while I'm riding, I have the quick capture setting in the camera set to on. That way, all you need to do to begin recording is press the record button. It powers the camera up and begins recording within a few seconds. For any cameras out of reach while I'm riding, I use the smart remote to begin recording. Over the last 3 years, I've added a third GoPro, which I keep in my Karma gimbal for some of those various non-riding shots. But the amazing stabilization of the Hero 7 and now the Hero 8 are about to make the gimbal obsolete in the near future. That'll also save me some space in my top case. For the most part, I shoot in full auto 1080 60 frames per second linear. I'm learning and experimenting more with different settings and ProTune, etc., and plan to begin experimenting with 4K also in the future. But as the new cameras that are released get better with improved features, so does my full auto footage. From my Norway trip in 2017 forward, I've been using a drone on my trips. I started off with a Mavic Pro on the Scandinavian trip, the Mavic Air on the Colorado and Southwest trip, and currently the Mavic 2 Zoom. It's another great way to add some variety to those videos, but I'm also still in the learning process on that piece of equipment too. And finally, I edited all of my videos using Pinnacle Ultimate. I know there's lots of great video editing software out there, but I've used Pinnacle for about 20 years and I know it fairly well, and I'm pretty happy with the results. I really hope you were able to get at least a little bit of useful information out of this series, and if you do take this trip, maybe I'll see you on the road somewhere along the way.